Hello and welcome also from my side. It's a pleasure to be here today and to speak a little bit about engineering practices to reduce organizational friction. And I guess my talk title does not leave much room for creativity, right? So we will talk about organizational friction and engineering practices. But before doing so, I wanted quickly to talk about the ideal state, right? So in the ideal state, you all perhaps experienced at one point everyone in your company exactly knows what to do. You know what tickets to solve, which bugs to do. The sales team and the development team are going hand in hand. Everything is well aligned, and then depending on how you want to see it, just like Pac-Man eating those golden coins, you're closing customer cases, or if you're thinking more competitive, just like Pac-Man after eating the super pill is chasing the ghost, you're driving the competition in front of you. So that's a state of total clarity. Everyone in the org knows what to do. And basically, there's an intuitive, basic, deep understanding of what you're standing up for every day in the whole org, right? So is that the state for everyone here you are currently working in, or do you experience something different? Hands up. Okay, Ollie, Ollie is living in that state, but some others perhaps not. And I think if organizations get bigger and growing, if you're not like 10, 20, 30 people anymore, but a few hundreds, you will experience that suddenly you need to think about those things and you need to really invest hard work in order to get close to the state again, right? And there's a lot of literature and smart principles how to work with that. People are discussing about visions and missions. They are discussing about values of the company. And everyone here, or most likely, will have heard from the golden circle, the why, how, and what you're doing. So there's a lot of approaches and tools to think about what your company is actually there for. And then, like, especially if you're an engineer, you might always have wondered, okay, why all this nonsense, right? Why are we doing that? And people are not doing that because it's so fancy or modern or something like that, but because it requires hard work to get this alignment back. And it's very important that the, like, so to say, nominal belief system of your company, so what your boss thinks, what you're there for, and the internal belief system, so what you feel, what you're there for, that those things align so that your reality as an engineer and the reality of your CFO and CEO, whatever, that they align roughly, okay? And there comes a thing that is culture. And this internal belief system I talked about, that is, from my perspective, that is the real culture. And I guess there's a confusion in the tech industry somewhat because people always think that culture is wearing hoodies or being on first-name patterns, so like Duzen in German. But that's just a tiny part. And the actual culture of the company is a lot about what things really are. And if this culture and your internal belief system and the like nominal part, the strategy and the vision, all the big words, they don't align, you're more like in this situation where you feel like chased by the ghost, right? And so that's why we want to talk about organizational friction today. And so the next roughly 20, 25 minutes, I will want to talk about organizational friction, what it is, what it feels like, how you can tell that you are in this situation, and also about some common engineering practices you probably already living kind of, or perhaps not. Then we will talk about a little shift in perspectives regarding all this kind of things, and I will quickly share my thoughts, how I see it from our current perspective at Shopware, which is an e-commerce vendor, basically. So let's start with organizational friction. And I think there's all kind of symptoms that you can tell that you are experiencing organizational friction. It can be resistance to change in the teams, it can be subpar performance, missed deadlines, it can be high turnover rates, so many people quitting, so to say, but all kinds of poor communication as well. And I think it's important to understand that the things that you are experiencing are related to this kind of organizational frictions and that there are certain patterns that can help you to get out of it or to reduce the pain at least. And Recently, I read a blog post where someone said organizational friction is somewhat like the Grinch that stole your productivity. And I think that's really matching because sometimes it comes with symptoms like, I don't know, unnecessary e-communication, a lot of Slack messages, a lot of mails, and so on. And that's interestingly, if you talk to engineers, for example, mostly they will feel that pain. They will see a lot of communication that is not value adding for them, right? But it can also be, for example, low morale or kind of political behavior and stuff like that. Lack of focus, you're doing all kinds of things at the same time. Or perhaps just missing attention to customer feedback, right? So you know that something is odd and you want, like, in your vision that you see about your product, something should be different, but somehow it doesn't make it, right? So it doesn't make it to the roadmap, it's not fixed. And this can all be indications of this kind of organizational friction. I also like to think about it like walking in quicksand. So if your daily routine work, like where you really want to get things done and things delivered, if you just feel like it's not really going forward, that can be organizational friction. And there's also some examples. So for example, some years ago, when we were creating a new version of our product, there was a lot of fights between the engineering team and the design team about, for example, how much technical debt are we willing to accept for a certain customer journey or for specific aspects of the customer journey. And so that was something that caused a lot of friction in the teams, but it can also, as mentioned, be things like low quality mindset where you just have the feeling that things are just not up to standard. Or what I also think is the existing of all kinds of initiatives, programs, and projects to shape the behavior. And on the first glance, it might look like a smart idea. So you identify a problem, and then you do an initiative to fix a problem. But usually, that's not how things work. And initiatives can be a good thing, but they are not there to shape the behavior, right? So the behavior of people is something cultural, something that is shaped by their daily routine, and like having a lot of programs, initiatives, and stuff like that usually could be an indicator that you're experiencing organizational friction as well. Yeah, and so basically, I would say there's like a lot of ways to do the right things in a wrong way, and that's usually what initiatives can tend to have as an outcome, right? So like you're doing now DevOps initiatives, and then people somehow some deployments and such like things like that, but that's not really DevOps. DevOps starts with the mindset, and it does not start with the deployment, right? So I think it's a bit tricky, and so that's a difficult part about organizational friction. And also, I guess it's always so important to understand that it's not always like a black and white differentiation. So for example, the example I gave earlier regarding designers and engineers fighting over certain stuff, that can be a good thing. It is a good thing. You want to work in an environment where people have constructive conflicts about value-adding stuff, about important stuff. So if I would make the choice, I would rather work in that environment than in an environment where people do not have that conversation. I want to work with people who are passionate about things that they think are important. The difference is that, or the important part you need to get right is it needs to be constructive and value-adding, and that means that people will have fights perhaps, and also passionate fights, but at the end of the day, people are disagree and commit, and not the loudest wins, but the best arguments, for example. So also, not fighting and having arguments is not a bad thing, right? So it can be a good thing as well. So we wanted to talk about engineering practices to reduce organizational friction. And one very important one that all of you already heard a lot about is agility. And what went a bit wrong in the industry perhaps is that when people talk about agility, they think Scrum, Kanban, less safe, and so on. So there are a lot of terms and frameworks that will help you being more agile. But actually, and I guess most of you already realized, doing, I don't know, a retro meeting once a month or having a stand-up does not really make you more agile, right? It's a framework, but again, you need to get the base right. You need to get the understanding right in your team in order to be more agile. And that, for example, means that you encourage flexibility in your team, right? So that you have deep collaboration, streamlined processes, good communication, cooperation between the teams, and so on. So that is way more important than just faking some kind of artifacts or rituals and so on. So you need to get the understanding right. And from my experience, that is something that many teams initially get wrong when starting with this agile framework. So getting the deep understanding. An example I also have is, for example, close communication regarding close communication. So, for example, in Shopware, openness is one of our core values, right? And if you look for the values of the company, there's openness is the first one, and also one that people are quite passionate about in the company. But some, I guess, years ago already, I hired someone, and he started working for us. And after half a year, he said, "Daniel, one thing is really odd for me. I'm working here for half a year, and still every now and then I'm added to yet another closed Slack channel, to another back channel, to this team channel, to that initiative channel, and so on." And just then I realized how many closed channels there are, where people having like more private discussions and so on. And even though there is like the engineering channel and the project channel, most of the conversations happened in this closed back channels. And just by talking about it and then asking the teams what their concerns are and what their ideas are about it, this suddenly changed. And so I really didn't see that we had this close communication culture, but then when someone entered from an external perspective, I learned that quite quickly, and also the teams adapted quite quickly, so that it was not an intentional pattern, I would say, or something there where there was a big agenda behind it, but it was just a behavior that somehow made it to the culture. And now suddenly more and more teams are shifting to this more open Slack communications, and at the same time, people also started shifting around this end-of-day messages. So instead of discussing in the stand-up every day again, what I'm currently doing, what do I want to do tomorrow, where am I blocked, people just started making that a short message in the open Slack channel. So everyone who's interested can read it, everyone who's not interested cannot read it. And in the daily stand-up, you can really invest the time to have a short check-in, especially with remote work. This is getting more important, right? So the teams have a short check-in for the day. They briefly talk about perhaps the challenges and invest the time in the things that's productive for them instead of like following a certain protocol. And that's, for me, a good example that even if, for example, openness and communication is an important value, you still might get it wrong in your daily doing with this kind of examples. And a third example I want to give regarding agility is scientific experiments. So every org is to a certain degree rigid, so there are certain patterns. You're doing releases a certain way, you're doing your dailies in a certain way, you're doing your retros in a certain way. And scientific experiments can be a model, a framework again for your team to think about what they really want to improve. And it can be like default solution for them to say, okay, this one is not working out for me, and so I observed this and that behavior, I'm proposing this and that change, and my hypothesis is that we will see, I don't know, shorter ticket lead times after a few months, and then you can just check back on that and check if the experiment was successful or not. So give the people the possibility to think about the org they are living in, the processes they have, and so on, and also give them ways and hooks to change it. Because change should not be so much management-driven, it should be more team-driven, right? And giving the tools more room and more understanding about how to do that, I guess that's really important. Talking about teams, there's also some aspects that you can do in order to prevent too much organizational friction, and I guess Lars already mentioned a few points regarding that. So I guess it's very important to have, on a general level, to have cross-functional teams. So in every org, this might mean something different, but usually it's a good practice to don't have artificial boundaries between your quali ops, between your designers, between your engineers. And if you have something like operations, you also want to have that included, right? So having cross-functional teams and working deeply together is very important. And talking about, for example, the DevOps or DevSecOps, also like having a more modern understanding of what engineering is about, where the boundaries are, if there are any, and prevent situations where people, for example, throw code over the fence and then some other people need to live with it and deploy it and fix it and so on. So there's a lot of like best practice there already, how to shape your team and how to bring them in a situation where they communicate, where they are responsible, and where you don't have artificial borders that like prevent communication at the end of the day. Then also one that should not be missing is user-centric design and user-centric development. So having a deep understanding of what your customer needs are and how you can improve your product to convince more customers and make your customers happier is something that should not be only owned by your product management or your product owners. The teams need to be involved in there and understand it, right? Because this will help engineers to understand what is actually meant by requirement. It will reduce the numbers of rework where you like throw away features and build new ones and stuff like that. All the things can be prevented of having a culture where also engineers and other parts of the teams really care about customers, customer feedback, and what's driving the customer around. That was something, so for example, in my career at one point, I was taking care of the enterprise product, and with that also came that I was guiding more sales reps to pitches and taking part in pitches, or also consulting customers who had perhaps specific performance requirements and stuff like that. That is really insightful, so you can like work 10 years or dozens of years in the industry, but this contact to the customer and really understanding what they care about, that's really interesting, especially as an engineer, because usually you might tend to have a different imagination of what customers care about. So don't think that you are the customer. And then another, I don't know if that's an engineering practice, but I guess it's really an important principle to understand, and that is self-efficacy in the teams, right? So people also call it like self-service or, for example, ownership. And usually in management, you might have discussions, so like, why is no one taking ownership? And recently in social media, I saw someone saying, yeah, no one is taking ownership because like taking ownership is called stealing, right? So you need to give ownership to people. And I guess that's also a typical trap you have if you're wondering, why is no one taking ownership? Yeah, there might be a reason for it, because someone is claiming the ownership over those things. And usually it doesn't make sense to blame the team for it, right? So also ask yourself, what are the things that you want people to take ownership about, and what is stopping them from doing that, and what can you change, can you do that you have passionate people who say, okay, I want to drive that topic, or I want to go forward there. So that's really important. And I guess that's also missed in many conversations, and people tend to have a too simple understanding of how, for example, ownership works. Yes. So as next topic, we wanted to talk a little shifting in perspectives. And this is also, again, like cycling back to the subline of my talk, like doing the right things right. Because what I see happening a lot is that people somehow start with a desired outcome. So like, you know, the engineers now do deployments, and then we have DevOps or something like that. But that's not really how things work in reality. And this is also where I see a lot of organization and teams failing, because they want to do the right things, but they don't really have an idea of how to get to this ideal place. And then you might just introduce new processes or new rules, how people should behave. But it needs to be culture driven. And that's really the differentiation I see a lot. So just taking the outcome and then hoping that the rest will fall in the right direction, I never saw that actually working. And also Lars, the previous speaker, talked about Conway for a minute. So basically, Conway's law you will all know. So a system design will over time mimic the communication structure of the organization you're in. And then there's also, I guess, many of you, or perhaps even everyone involved in a reorg at one point, will have talked about the inverse Conway maneuver. So the idea then is, okay, if that's the case, if the system design mimics the communication design, I will just shape my teams, or just the communication, the teams, the org, the way I want to have the system design. And then by some magic, by having many teams working on own stuff, I will end up with a service architecture or something like that. And I guess it's a good idea, it's a good concept, it's a good tool, but in reality, again, things are not that easy, and there is limitations to Conway's law and the inverse Conway maneuver that you need to understand. It's not an all-powerful tool. And my typical example would be that having, for example, an existing architecture, an existing rigid application design, and then just creating teams in a different way because you want to have a less rigid architecture or a more service-oriented architecture, this will not automatically make you a fancy microservice company. It will just add friction in the engineering teams because the structure they are living in does not at all match the design they are working with every day. And so this is just adding friction to the team. And somehow I see it a lot overquoted where people think, okay, doing that will somehow make things work. But that's also not grabbing the topic by the culture. And so I guess the overall topic for that would be like rigidity, so to say, as a headline. So you cannot fix a broken system design by just introducing inverse Conway's maneuver and then having some other system design as an outcome. And when we talked about rigidity, I mentioned it in the context of system architecture, but you need to also understand it in the context of your culture, of the communication structures in the team. They are also rigid, so people are not machines. Just by putting them into other teams, they will not work differently. And there's so many reasons why this can go wrong. So, for example, I experienced it not working out just because the naming of teams were implying some kind of hierarchy, for example. So just team names can mess things up. Or just moving, for example, all your senior ICs into certain teams and non-seniors into other teams. All these things they will be well noted in the system of your engineers, of your teams, and people will realize that. And so what I want to say with that is the inverse Conway maneuver is not such an easy thing, and you really need to understand also cultural aspects of your organization when you're thinking about how can I reduce organizational friction. And that's why I currently think, and that might be a bit a luxury problem that we are in as an e-commerce vendor, so it might not be applicable for every engineer and not for every organization. But what I see is that giving the engineering organization the place to also shape the picture of what the product really is and what they excel at, and then making that part of the internal belief system of the company, that is a really powerful future. And so I see it, for example, working very well if you're thinking about the microservice community and people talking about microservices or vendors in the microservice space. People are really passionate about it. And when we entered the US, we even learned that people will talk about microservices on merchant-facing conferences, so or merchant-facing fairs. So people are really passionate about it and they make it part of their identity. And I guess that's not really because it's like the best since sliced bread and it's a true answer to everything. It's because those companies manage it to make the internal belief system of what the engineers care about and what they are passionate about and how they can optimize their work, that those companies are able to make that something part of their identity and also make it useful to the engineers out there. So especially in the technical space, I see that engineering, and especially in e-commerce and as an e-commerce vendor, I see that really putting engineering like first in that regard and thinking about what do my customers, my developers out there, my partners, but especially my engineers internally need and how should ideal development look like, and then thinking from there how to like make it something that your team can be passionate about and that can be driven by your engineering team. That's way more powerful than just trying to munch in the strategy top down, right? And I guess there is some tools for it. So we already mentioned microservice, and if if you know Shopware, you know that it has nothing to do with microservices, right? I was thinking about it for quite some time, and what I think is really interesting is approaches of, we call it platform engineering, or also platform as a product, or developer platforms. And I guess that's really an interesting approach, not as an all-powerful solution again, don't get me wrong, but it can be an interesting approach if you're a tech company out there, if you're making your technology a product to the customers, because development platforms, internal development platforms, have been around for years, and they really try to reduce the friction in the development teams and like productize that also for external teams, right? And that's what currently is happening in the market, I guess, so that internal development platforms where teams have tool set that make their daily development easier, that helps them to deploy easier, that gives them tools for observability and monitoring and so on. This is old news, basically. So teams have been working that for long times. And what I'm currently seeing and what I find quite interesting is that people start to productize those things. So that's an extremely good developer experiences with all the tool set, starting from how can I start developing an extension, over how do I run a local environment setup or local dev environment, over how can I create a production setup, how can I deploy it, how do I configure the CI/CD pipeline. There's thousands of friction points in developing this kind of features. So that's what I find is quite interesting about that. So I said it's currently my current thinking for Shopware as a specific e-commerce vendor, how I think how we can make this engineering mindset part of our product ideology, so to say, and at the same time really have something that people inside and outside are passionate about, right? And just to draw a little conclusion, I would say when it comes to organizational friction and engineering practices, don't get sold on the easy answers, so also not on the ones I propose, sondern really understand what's behind it. So what is driving your team around, and why are you experiencing this friction? Where do you experience it? And also that's something that was mentioned earlier today. You need to understand your organization as a system. So this is all related to system theory, that you have your system, your organization is a living organism, and you will not change its behavior by some top-down measures or like just rolling out a new strategy. That's not how those things works. And that's, for example, especially when it comes to engineering, a lot about architectural and cultural rigidity. And for that reason, especially in existing systems, and that's a situation we are all in, do not easily apply like things like inverse convey maneuver, or think, okay, if we just start with the outcome and we start doing this certain practice, then things will automatically fall in the right direction. So those things might just introduce more friction, and there's basically no scientific model that somehow people will randomly do different things by themselves, right? And for me, especially as an engineer, I would say find the sweet spot where your engineering topics really align with the company vision. And I guess many people here are from the e-commerce space, and I guess that's not so complicated because we productize our technical product obviously every day, right? So that's what e-commerce is about, and getting like this e-commerce first, or this engineering first aspect in there, and being passionate about engineering and help people to have a great developer experience. It's something that I'm pretty excited about, and that I think can help with a lot of those points. And yeah, just as an open question, I would say, think about how you can make your engineering team driver of such a change. So don't let people be in a passive situation where they think, okay, there's a lot of things happening, but help your team to drive the change, to understand what they want to change in your product, in their developer experience, in their daily work, and then be creative about finding the sweet spots where those things can map with the organization. Yes, I hope we have a few minutes for some questions. So my question is, what questions do you have?
Once again, we have the microphone, so raise your hand if you have any question. One question. Yes, Martha.
Hey, thank you. Could you show the last slide, please? Regarding the last point, could you make some more specific examples?
So in our case, for example, we were thinking, so in order not to get too specific, so we had a situation where we were facing certain challenges from an engineering perspective, and I was experiencing that the teams were like somehow feeling overwhelmed and were not sure how to align, so how to do that in a sustainable way, right? And so my main point about that is take that serious. Don't try to talk them into like hooray and we will do it and something like that. I guess that's happening way too often. But really get the team into a shape where they are solving those problems and where they say, okay, if we want to do it, we should do it this and that way. And yes, it also means that you need to give them the certainty that those things are also heard and that you are willing to adapt your strategy regarding it. So it does not work if you're saying, okay, in reality, we will go that direction and somehow the engineering team tries to do something else. That doesn't work. So you need to be also as a manager, you need to be able to like give that back and like immerse it into your strategy and adapt the course you're going, right? That's, I don't know if it makes sense for you. And
Cool. Any other question?
For the like product engineering mindset, I think from one perspective, it is important for engineering to drive the changes, but I think at the same time, they need to be aligned with the customer, like what's being provided to the customer, what the product vision is, and it needs to be like a two-way communication stream.
absolutely. So that's also, for example, as mentioned, we are thinking about like more shaping things into this platform engineering approach. And one concern is that because we have all of our engineers are like internal customers, there's a high danger of them pretending that they are the customer, right? So they are like, I'm an engineer as well, so we will do it this and that way. And so that's a good example because that's also something we discussed. You need to have the customers on the table, so to say, the developers from the community on the table, because it will be a mess otherwise, because internal and external developers are two different things, right? Thank you.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. I have a question regarding your experience when to manage when we have a major feature that is needed to deliver, and how can you ensure that your cross-functional team when they deliver and they ensure that on the parameters, the argument and the new feature will work together, especially when you have the back end, front end, and DevOps team that are needed to collaborate in the same way?
So if I understand correctly, so how do I make sure that in cross-functional teams are working properly together to deliver the right feature at time and with the right quality and so on? So from my understanding, that's something that's easier with cross-functional teams, honestly, because I think, at least in my experience, we have, for example, product managers and designers and engineers, so they are part of the team. So perhaps the product managers are a bit more outside, but they are usually very close to the team, and so I don't experience big problems with that. But also, what we are currently discussing about is that even we want to have this accountability more in the teams, right? And that again means they need to understand what the customer cares about. They need to have touch points with the customers. You cannot always wait for the PM to check the feature, right? So that's self-efficacy. So that's teams being able to decide if the feature is right and so on. So that's why they are cross-functional.
Okay. One last question.
So let's say you successfully transform the culture of the team so that it's more healthy and it adapt to what you expect. Have it have it ever happened to you that you make a mistake and then the team fall back to the old culture?
So I think I got you. So you said if it happened that the team like adapted some culture and then fall back to the old behavior, so to say, right? I would say it didn't happen in the way that people were fully on the new side, and then so it's not like that binary. So it's not they are adapting new practices, and then 2 months later they are fully falling apart again. But what I see experiencing a lot that's this initiative topic, right? So that people try to do things differently, but they never become part of the actual culture. And then you have all this kind of initiatives, and usually they don't die. You also you still have it in Confluence or in your handbook or wherever. It's all there still, but no one is living it. And then you are in a situation that you have all this nominal things you are doing as an engineering team, but the reality is completely different. So that's usually what I experience, right? So that would be the thing I would look after to really get it into culture.
And is there any tips so that we don't have zombie initiatives?
I guess the answer is a bit dumb, but it's also true. You need to talk to people. So I guess the problem is that initiatives are usually something where you have an all hands and then things are announced and stuff like that. And I guess way more powerful, even though slower, and even though as a manager it feels a bit like you don't have full control, but it's way more powerful to find individual contributors, senior ICs in your team, talking to them, get them passionate about things, and then see how they are driving the change forward. But it's really a mindset shift because you need the folks that want to do that they're able to do that. But if you get it right, you will just by having these conversations and checking in regularly, you will have people talking about things without you like pushing about it or having some like tight framework. But it's a bit difficult, and it depends on the team and on the experience of the manager, on the experience of the ICs. But that's also, I experienced that way more things should be discussed like individually by talking about stuff and being passionate about it and making it less of a top-down.